Falk, the Senior Vice President, Director of International Security Studies here at the Wilson Center, with a multi-decade background on nonproliferation and deterrence issues, looking at rogue states, most recently publishing on North Korea, on Iran, and on deterring nuclear terrorism. So we're very pleased to have all of them here. We're looking at options for the way forward. And just to set the stage, from the U.S. government in the last 2 days, we've had two statements on where the U.S. government thinks we are right now. And I mentioned in the last panel the tweet from President Trump saying North Korea relations is best it has ever been with the United States, no testing, getting remains, hostages returned, decent chance of denuclearization. Time will tell what will happen with North Korea, but at the end of the previous administration, relationship was horrendous and very bad things were about to happen. Now a whole different story. I look forward to seeing Kim Jong-un shortly. Progress being made, big difference. The day before, the Director of National Intelligence said, we currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival. Our assessment is bolstered by our observations of some activity that is inconsistent with full denuclearization. So part of our understanding of where things go is based on our understanding of where things are and where we want them to go. We talked in the last session about how we define success and how we define failure. And so I think we have three terrific scholars who can look at different aspects and different angles about how things may proceed in the coming months and years. And so to start, we'll just go in order. First, Professor Soya, then Kato Sarah-Blanchette, and then Robert Litvak. So, Professor Soya.
Thank you, Abe. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be back here. I used to be a Japan scholar here in the 2013, and I thought this auditorium was bigger. And, maybe I got older, and so things became smaller. Please excuse me for my somewhat weak voice. I arrived very late at night yesterday, and my body clock is telling me to go to bed, and so I'll try to be kept waked up by exciting comments and discussions. And well, in talking about a way forward, everything I'm going to say is, of course, hypothetical, and nobody knows for sure what is really the case. And that may be the nature of this issue that we are discussing. And so that gives some room for, again, hypothetical discussion. That on the basis of that, I would like to start with my interpretation and some of my colleagues, particularly North Korean specialists, interpretation of what Mr. Kim Jong-un is trying to do. And I think this is a very critical starting point, whether or not you would base our we talked about strategy, importance of strategy, whether or not we base our discussions on strategy on this particular point regarding the seriousness of Kim Jong-un in terms of what he's talking about. And of course, it's easy to be suspicious and doubtful of his intentions. But this is my personal view. Unless we have a measure of trust in what Kim Jong-un is saying, I think building a so-called strategy would not be meaningful. And if we don't trust him, it's a non-starter. And so in talking about the way forward, this is a sort of premise of what I'm going to say in terms of my observation of what he's been trying to do. And starting with the simple facts. North Korea tested nuclear weapons for the first time in October 2006. And after that, they have conducted nuclear experiments 6 times. And the last test being September last year, 2017. And the missile launch, the first missile launch was May 1993. And after that, second launch was 1998, and followed by 2006 and 2009. But after Kim Jong-un took power, December 2012 and June 2014, February 2016, and after that it's really amazing. In the single year of 2017, February, twice in March, 3 times in April, 3 times in May, and June, July, 2 times in August, and September and November last 2017. And after that, they completely stopped both nuclear tests and missile tests. And according to a colleague of mine who says he cannot finish a day without reading Nodong Shinmun, North Korean Labor Party newspaper, and he has enlisted the facilities and places where Kim Jong-un has visited in the past years. And before the fall of 2017, most of the facilities where Kim Jong-un visited are military related. And after that, completely shifted to facilities of civil life and economic developments. And so this is just maybe a superficial proof, but from this, I think one can make a judgment that he has made somewhat a strategic decision to shift his emphasis from nuclear development to economic developments. And these two have constituted so-called a Pyongyang strategy, a dual-track strategy. And I used to think and argue that nuclearization, I mean, putting emphasis on nuclear weapons is like a new look strategy of Eisenhower. Nuclear weapons are cheap, cheaper than building conventional weapons. So focusing upon nuclear weapons would mean that they could shift some of the resources from the military domain to economic development. And if that was the logic, then holding to nuclear weapons is a must in order for this Pyongyang strategy to succeed. This is how I used to think, and I used to argue, therefore, as long as Pyongyang continues, giving up nuclear weapon is not likely. Theoretically, it's impossible. And I think still there is some logic to it in Pyongyang, but Kim Jong-un started to say something new, which is he's ready to give up nuclear weapons. But the message is, if it ever happens, this will happen at the very end of the process, which he foresees. And the end point would mean North Korean regime would be secure, and maybe there would be no conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And at that point, giving up nuclear weapon is one option, possible option. So whether or not you should trust Kim Jong-un or not, I think the point is, if he is really serious about denuclearization, even if as a result of phased sort of attempts, I think there is enough reason to sort of doubt. But whether or not we will doubt Kim Jong-un's kind of statement regarding his interest in starting a new game or even a new strategy, I think this is a very critical point to debate at the entrance of this, thinking about the future. And I would say this because unless we take him seriously to some extent, there will be no room for the rest of us to think about this strategically. In other words, this should be taken as an opportunity for us to exploit or whatever. I mean, also on the basis of this, and we have to speak united. We have to cooperate among ourselves. So we have to think of as maybe a single strategy, if possible. We being, again, as we have discussed in the previous session, mostly Japan, U.S., and South Korea. And I think this is, if we don't really get into this process of dealing with him in a serious way and in a truly strategic way, we might lose some good opportunity to think about the future of the Korean Peninsula. And whether we are going to succeed in this attempt or not, of course, nobody knows. But not trying anything, I think, is something which is really, in Japanese, we have a term, mottainai. What's the English term for that? It's sorry? Wasteful. Wasteful, yeah. And so that's a simple assumption of my argument of this in terms of a way forward. But this does not mean, as I said at the outset, that we can trust Kim Jong entirely in the process of talking to him. And so this is a different issue of trustworthiness of Kim Jong. And the most recent kind of sort of case would be the New Year statement by him, some time ago this month. And according to a Korean one of the abductees who came back from Korea to Japan, he wrote a newspaper sort of column just recently in one of the local papers, which I happened to read. And according to his information, this would be known to Korea specialists, of course, but New Year address by the supreme leader is terribly important for all the Korean people, North Korean people. And everybody should be well dressed and listen to the leader's New Year address. And they have to bring the text to their each work units, and they have to engage in debate, discussions, which is, of course, the educational process for the North Korean people to know what the leader is thinking about. So this statement is terribly, terribly important. And in that statement, he said very, very different things from previous years. One thing which is obvious is he has not given up his attempt to deal with the United States and others on the basis of his shifting strategy under this Pyongyang dual track approach. And one North Korean specialist mentioned to me in our private conversation, I didn't know this because I didn't look at that video necessarily. There was a national flag behind Kim Jong-un, a party flag, a national flag. And according to him, this was the very first case where a national flag was put up side by side with party flag. And I'm curious if he would be right or not, but he bravely predicted that Kim Jong-un may come to General Assembly of the United Nations this fall. And there will be third Kim Jong-un Trump meeting. And so putting emphasis on the nation state, statehood, on top of the party, that was terribly new from this New Year's address. And also, this was the very first occasion when Kim Jong-un didn't mention his father and grandfather in his major speech. He didn't mention his father, grandfather almost at all in this. And in previous speeches, he did, because that was source of his legitimacy. But now, so that means he is confident about his kind of leadership. So things are moving, I think, from North Korean side. And so therefore, all the more it's a pity that, in the previous session, Japan-Korea things have already been dealt with, and Japan's Article 9 thing has also already been dealt with. So I'm happy that I don't have to talk about them. And so it's a so simple thing that I should say is it's all the more pity, about the current state of Japan-South Korea relations, because there is golden opportunity to exploit strategically, among countries concerned. And Okay, I will stop here, and then I hope this would give more than enough fruits for controversies in our discussions.
Thank you very much, Saya-san.
Yeah, I want to apologize again for not being Mark Lippert. And Abe is going to take on South Korean baseball references on my and his behalf. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center, where I'm delighted to be studying alongside such esteemed colleagues. I focus on the use of World War II history in present-day Russia, China, and North Korea. So I thought I would draw a little bit on that, but primarily from my experience before this, which was as a journalist for the British broadcaster Sky News. So I was based first in Moscow, but then in Beijing. And from Beijing, spending a lot of time covering the Korean Peninsula and getting a chance to travel to North Korea twice. So one thing I think I wanted to stress at the outset here is just how much most of North Korea is not like what we tend to see on television. So I think we tend to focus from this perspective on the military parades, on the new building blocks going up in Pyongyang. About 3 million people live in Pyongyang of a population of 25 million. My maths is not great, but that's close to 90% of the population does not live in Pyongyang. And when you leave Pyongyang, it's really striking how, firstly, desperately poor it is. There's a lot of very badly eroded farmland. There are people working in very difficult conditions. You see very little farm machinery. You see oxes being used to plough the fields. There are ongoing and very real problems with food supply. I've got statistics here that 2 in 5 North Koreans are undernourished. 1 in 3 children is anemic. 1 in 4 children at World Food Programme supported nurseries are stunted, which means their growth is stunted, and that is not considered to be a reversible condition. There's one of the highest rates of tuberculosis infection outside sub-Saharan Africa. In short, life is very, very difficult. Life is very, very poor in these areas. And the reason that is given for that is the hostile imperialist policy of the United States. So when you go out into the countryside and when you go to, I've had the chance to go to North Korea's side of the DMZ, and when you look out from there, the story that you are told is that North Korea was the victim here, that North Korea was attacked by the United States and its puppet allies in South Korea, and that the United States is responsible for all of these current day problems in North Korea. There are sort of 2 what I call fundamental lies that the Kim regime bases its legitimacy on. So number 1 is the idea that the current leader, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, liberated the Korean Peninsula. So as that story was told in the early days, it was with help from the Soviet army. Their role has now been written out, and he is said to have done this single-handedly. So he brought the Second World War to a close and freed the Korean Peninsula from Japanese occupation. The second fundamental lie, as I've already referenced, is that the United States and South Korea started the Korean War. And these are not stories that are fading over time. So one of the things that Kim Jong-un did when he came to power, I think we focus obviously, understandably, on the missile program and on the nuclear program, but he also invested in museums. So he spent a lot of money renovating, enlarging 2 key museums. So one called the Victoria's Fatherland Liberation Museum in Pyongyang, which is effectively telling their story of the Korean War. The other, the Sinchon Museum of American Atrocities. So this is focusing on terrible allegations of atrocities committed by American forces, for which no credible evidence is offered, I should say. But this is a very graphic, sort of life-size scale models of these atrocities being committed, soundtrack of screams playing. This is somewhere that Kim Jong-un has visited, has described as a foothold of socialist ideology, talks about United States cannibalism. I mention this because I think we focus on the security side of the Kim regime, but this domestic, political, and ideological side, I think is really important just to understand how central these war stories are to Kim Jong-un's ongoing legitimacy. So I think to our discussion, that gives very real limits to how far this can go in terms of what comes next. So firstly, in terms of retaining control of information, this is clearly something that the Kim Jong-un regime takes very seriously, because you can be executed in North Korea for distributing South Korean DVDs. There is a need, whatever happens in terms of economic development, to retain control of the information that is getting into North Korea such that it doesn't undermine Kim Jong-un's legitimacy. So I think perhaps that means special economic zones would be a model, would be a way to go. But in terms of general exchange of the population, more widespread economic development, the sort of vision that Donald Trump has painted, I doubt that would be possible. So I think I guess I'll probably sum up there to leave some more for the Q&A. But I just want to bring this angle to this discussion of it's not just that Kim Jong-un has to justify the nuclear program. It's also that he needs this external enemy. So if he were to give that up, and if relations with the United States demonstrably improve and threats of fire and fury are no longer circulating, he needs something in that place. Perhaps that can be economic development, but for reasons of information infiltration, I think there are limits to how far that can go.
Thank you very much. Rob.
Thank you, Abe. Thanks to Shihoko Goto, Jean Lee, and Abe for the organization of this really important and timely meeting. This final session focuses on considering options for a way forward. My remarks today are drawn from a piece that just appeared in Lawfare blog. It's called Nuclear Diplomacy with Iran and North Korea, from Transformational to Transactional. My field's comparative nuclear, what we hope is non-proliferation. So I've worked across cases, and that's been the approach that I bring to this issue. As Abe's remarks teeing up this session revealed, the Trump administration's strategy toward North Korea and Iran and North Korea, both countries that the Trump administration has designated as rogue states, with both countries they're at an impasse, and we're going to focus on North Korea today. After the June 2018 summit in Singapore, Trump tweeted there's no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea, but with the Kim regime balking at its commitment to denuclearization, there'll be a second meeting at the end of this month, probably, in the hopes of putting things back on track. And I really want to just focus on the title of the piece that I had in the Lawfare blog. That's the argument that I want to present today, the need for a shift from a transformational to a transactional approach. This dynamic, the impasse that we're at right now, reflects a persisting tension in U.S. policy. And that is whether the objective toward rogue states should be to change their regime's behavior or to change the regimes themselves. Should nuclear diplomacy be transactional, focused narrowly on the discrete nuclear challenge, or should it be transformational, comprehensively addressing North Korea's as well as Iran's objectionable behavior? The argument here from those promoting the transformational approach is that the threatening behavior derives from the character of the regime. So if you want to turn off the dangerous behavior, you got to change the regimes. That argumentation has been in place since 9/11, when that argument was central to the case for a preventive war against Iraq. Rhetorically, towards North Korea and also toward Iran, the Trump administration aspires for the transformational. A State Department official said recently, quote, "We are trying simultaneously to pressure and to negotiate comprehensive solutions with two rogue regimes at the same time. But this very ambitiousness is a strength, not a weakness," close quote. The Trump administration perceives the nuclear issue with North Korea as a proxy for a more fundamental debate about the character of the regime. And indeed, for North Korea, the nuclear diplomacy, and I make this comment based on the North Korea watchers we have here at the Wilson Center, who provide this sort of, to the extent one can glean the perspectives from North Korea, people like Katie who've been there, or Jean Lee, other experts we have working here. It would appear that the nuclear issue for North Korea is a proxy for how they want to define their relationship with the outside world. And here they face a double dilemma, that what the United States is demanding, full denuclearization, would deny North Korea capabilities they view as being essential to address an existential external threat. And at the same time, that's the demand side. On the offer side, that's also problematic because it's offering this autarkic state the possibility of integrating into the global economy. But that very process of integrating into the economy carries with it the very risk of political contagion that could be regime terminating. I mean, they're putting people to death for kind of DVDs from South Korea. That's how sensitive they are to the issue of political contagion. Now, the rogue issue, and I've written about this over a number of times. I was on the National Security Council staff when the term rogue state entered the U.S. foreign policy lexicon. And it wasn't a term invented by a political scientist to debate with colleagues in the field. The President of the United States and subsequent presidents of the United States, including President Trump, have asserted that the rogue states constitute a distinct category of states. And it carries with it baggage and a connotation of essentially being a crazy state. Now, North Korea is not a crazy state. It has a rationality that we must strive to understand. And we've got tremendous resources through our North Korea documentation program that provides a historical perspective, as well as the regional experts we have on staff and those that we bring to the Wilson Center to try to shed light on this opaque society. So it's not a crazy state. That said, it's not a normal state either. It's an outlier. It's got a GDP of $50 billion according to the CIA's best estimates, and it's hard to measure the North Korean economy. That's about the size of Dayton, Ohio. So imagine Dayton, Ohio with a nuclear arsenal about half the size of Great Britain. North Korea is a failed state with nuclear weapons. The data that Katie cited is mind-boggling, that you actually have physical differences between North and South Korea because this kind of grotesque experiment has been carried out where you feed one population 2,500 calories a day and you feed another 1,500 calories a day or less. That's the character of the regime that we're dealing with. And I'll circle back to how that feeds into this distinction between transformational and transactional, because it really requires a decoupling of the nuclear issue from the question of regime change, regime evolution. The Trump administration eschewed, it's ironic, and Washington doesn't do irony very well, that the man who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, has essentially eschewed a transactional approach towards these nuclear issues. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal with Iran, did precisely what I described. It decoupled the nuclear issue discreetly into a transaction, the purpose of which was to keep Iran's latent capability, the latent capability that derives from its ability to spin centrifuges and enrich uranium, to keep it latent. And that's all it attempted to do. That in turn opened the door to the criticisms that it wasn't transformational, that it constrained capabilities but left this threatening regime in power. And that was the basis upon which the Trump administration withdrew from the agreement. The Obama administration, defending why they acted as they did, argued, I think persuasively, that if they had attempted to turn this deal into a grand bargain with Iran, encompassing all kinds of issues like their role in Syria, et cetera, they would never have gotten any kind of deal. It's a legitimate debate, but those are the lines of it. With North Korea, the Trump administration also opted, so just to nail the point, coming into office, people thought, oh, this is an interesting precedent. Transactional diplomacy with North Korea, could that be applied in dealing with North Korea? The Iran case, the precedent, could it be applied, that approach of constraining capabilities, could it be applied to North Korea? The Trump administration eschewed the transactional, it opted for the transformational. When President Trump was inaugurated, North Korea was on the verge of a strategic breakout. And that breakout was both quantitative, as they ramped up their number of warheads, and it was qualitative through their mastery of long-range ballistic missiles and miniaturizing warheads. The unclassified projections, there's one from SICE, there's one from George Stanford CSAC, one from the RAND Corporation. The upper projection, based on how much weapons usable material, both enriched uranium and separated plutonium, that the North Koreans might have to fabricate into weapons, the range is as high as 100. That's where this high-end number comes from. The current range is estimated at somewhere in the 20 to 60 range. Imagine that. A country with an economy the size of Dayton, Ohio, with 100 nuclear weapons. Contrast that with South Korea, which is a $1.5 trillion economy. So North Korea is really an outlier in this most dynamic region in the world. What's precipitated the current crisis is American vulnerability. As my colleague Aaron Miller says, we've got fish to the east and west and weak neighbors to the north and south. Americans culturally do not do well with vulnerability. As previously mentioned, and as this room well knows, North Korea has been a nuclear weapon state since 2006. South Korea and Japan have lived under a North Korean nuclear shadow since that time. But the novel factor, what's precipitated this crisis, is America might be vulnerable, that they might be able to master this complex set of integrated technologies to be able to lob a warhead towards North America and hit something. And I don't think where does particularly matter. Somewhere between British Columbia and the Florida Keys probably would suffice for them. Whereas during the Cold War, we in the United States spent a lot of time testing to develop highly accurate warheads to within meters because they were going for precise targetings. I think that's less of a concern for North Korea. President Trump tweeted, "It won't happen." Meaning the United States wouldn't allow North Korea to attain these capabilities. That led to the crisis of 2017, where there was a rhetorical escalation. Most Americans went to the dictionary when the word dotard was used. There were dueling kind of Elton John lyrics. Trump called him Little Rocket Man. I thought the North Korean ministry had real humor. They came back with Madman Across the Water, which I thought was an inspired kind of Elton John inspired insult. They did 23 ballistic missile tests. They had a high yield nuclear detonation, which they claimed which was a hydrogen bomb. And then CIA Director Pompeo came back to this link between capabilities and the character of regimes. I mean, the United States may assert a general interest in nonproliferation, but in practice, we care about Iran more than Israel. It's the fact that it's the North Korean regime that has it. These capabilities in the hands of Kim Jong-un, and Pompeo said that the thing that is most dangerous about North Korea is the character who holds the control over them. And so that the threat was linked to the character of the regime. This brings us back to the whole optic of looking at North Korea as a rogue state, essentially a crazy state. The Singapore summit changed the psychology of the nuclear crisis because on Twitter, President Trump declared his friendship with Kim Jong-un. And essentially, North Korea has been viewed since then as more of a normal state. Like you could conduct diplomacy with it, not an irrational state where the military option would be the only way of addressing it. That's for the good. But what's emerged since then are these contrasting definitions of denuclearization. I trust that was covered this morning, how each side views it, and how the term is really quite loaded from the North Korean side, that what the conditions that they would need that were alluded to here to achieve denuclearization are pretty, significant, almost, speaking of transformational, they would be transformational. The American demand of CVID is essentially what National Security Advisor Bolton called the Libya model, like fork it over, we'll send over the C-5As, they'll cart it back to Oak Ridge, and we'll take it apart. That's not going to happen, particularly since the U.S.-led wars of regime change in 2003 and 2011 to take down Gaddafi, first Saddam and then Gaddafi. And that's why the Director of Central Intelligence has said, and it was repeated by DNI Coates, that North Koreans view the nuclear weapons as essential to regime survival. They also view it as the sole bargaining chip they have to monetize in their relations with South Korea and Japan. So let me just conclude make a couple points in conclusion. The nuclear diplomacy is an inflection point. And my argument is that the Trump administration should pivot from a transformational strategy to a transactional approach. The current transformational approach relies on this maximalist goal that can't be attained essentially without regime change. As long as the Kim family rules in Pyongyang, 0 warheads is not on the table. But 20 is better than 100. So what can we do to constrain the capabilities? I think there have been a number of proposals made for variations on freeze proposals, and I think that's the best one can realistically aspire to under the current circumstances. Maintain the missile testing freeze and the nuclear weapons freeze. That would preclude the additional testing that North Korea probably needs to master the complex integrated technologies to strike the United States with an intercontinental ballistic missile. The North Korean leader threw out in his New Year's speech that they were no longer producing warheads. That in school would get half credit for an answer. What we need to do is focus on the production of weapons usable material. That requires a declaration of what facilities they have, what ones we know through national technical means, as they say in the IC, of what they have where. I think that would be a near-term transactional goal that might be attainable, the verified cessation of the production of weapons usable material. So I conclude in my lawfare piece, diplomacy is an optimizing, not a maximizing function. And North Korea will not accept a transformational U.S. agenda, CVID plus integrate into the global economy. Goals, a demand and an offer that the North Koreans view as tantamount to committing regime suicide. Therefore, transactional diplomacy focused on the different elements that have been put forward in the technical community of what could be done to freeze or constrain North Korea's capabilities, I think is the plausible pathway forward. Moreover, once the United States decouples the issue of constraining capabilities from the question of regime survival, that becomes a basis, as was done under the JCPOA, to bring in international actors to bring meaningful pressure to bear on North Korea to constrain its capabilities, but recognizing there would have to also be something in it for us, for them rather, and that carries with it a certain moral hazard given the character of the regime here. But it would make the best of what is admittedly a bad situation. And the open question is whether the Trump administration, at this inflection point where there's an impasse, can navigate this transition from the transformational to the transactional.
Terrific presentations, all three. Thank you very much. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. I wanted to, for the first questions for all three of you, I wanted to sort of build off of this approach that Rob has talked about, shifting from transformational to a transactional approach. And I think each of you had a sort of different angle on this question. So for Soya-san, I was interested how your sense of how Japan would react, how the broader region would react to the United States sort of, lowering the threshold for success, to continue the discussion of before, of maybe not saying we need CVID or nothing, but rather saying we can make progress and that's a net benefit. If your sense of how, if that would be welcomed or being seen with concern in Japan for the rest of the region. Katie, you had talked about how central antagonism with the United States is for North Korea, for the North Korean propaganda, for how they justify the repressiveness, how they justify the poverty that the North Korean people face. Is your sense that North Korea, with that in mind, is that your sense that North Korea would be able to accept a transactional approach, or is transactionalism necessarily transformational for them, in that it would force them to describe the United States differently, force them to justify their regime differently? Is there a way to sort of drive a wedge between these two pieces with North Korea? And for Rob, I wonder your sense, if you think this process, if you think a long, sort of drawn-out negotiation is sustainable, especially if North Korea insists that denuclearization doesn't come till the very end, and how long you think that can be sustained, especially considering where our allies are, where the United States is politically, and the role that China is playing. Soya-san.
Well, maybe I'm sorry to say this, but my view is definitely a minority view, I think, among the Japanese. I think the dominant view in Japan is still fundamental distrust of North Korea. So, yeah, Patrick made a reference to this in the previous session, maybe here in the US as well. And so talking to North Koreans equals, being deceived. And I think that, so even Trump, Kim Jong-un summit in Singapore is portrayed as a great victory on the part of Kim Jong-un. And so getting into negotiations is a loss. I think that's a dominant feeling in Japan, including many experts. But specialists of North Korea and Korean Peninsula are somewhat different. And what I presented are based on my observation of our specialists' analysis and arguments about North Korea. So these views are there in Japan, but not necessarily dominant. And so therefore, getting into this process as a realistic issue, I cannot foresee any kind of feasible, prospect ahead. And another issue, as far as Japan is concerned, is of course abduction issue, which has always been, talked about by our leaders. And of course, this is a serious issue. But this is similar to CVID approach. Previously, CVID approach has been to put this issue at the entrance of the process. But whether being transitional or phased, I think virtually we are giving up the idea of putting CVID at the entrance, somewhere in the process or at the exit. But the point is, maybe shorter the process, the better. The earlier, the better. I think that's a discussion that we are now virtually getting into. And whether or not Japanese policies have caught up with those changes in recent years, abduction issue is similarly recognized. I mean, this is put as an entrance. Unless there is a so-called resolution of this issue, we will not get into serious negotiations with North Korea. So it's an entrance approach. But of course, the same thing could be said about this issue as well. This could be maybe much more effectively dealt with if put in as an issue to be dealt with in the process and kind of eventual so-called resolution. And as far as this issue is concerned, I think there is some myth regarding this about the importance of this issue among the Japanese public. Several opinion polls reveal that Japanese public opinion is a bit sober about, the kind of real kind of prospect regarding the so-called resolution. And this may not be a bad thing necessarily for our government. This means, our government, if they somewhat reshift, try to change somewhat the approaches to this, then public opinion may not be necessarily an obstacle in my observation. So it all matters to the political decisions, from the government, and so I'll stop here.
Very good, thank you.
To whether transactional approach can become transformational, I think the short answer is we can't know ahead of time. I certainly think a transactional approach could become transformational, but I think in order for Kim Jong-un to embrace it, he will need to believe that it would not be, and that he could isolate the various movement that would come with a transactional approach, and particularly have control over how much of the population is exposed to that, and have control of what I've written down here as collateral informational damage. I think Kim Jong-un does need to develop the economy. he is clearly making a concerted push in that direction. He does want to improve his people's lives, not necessarily through any sort of altruism, but as someone who is very focused on regime survival. Doing that would help to secure his position in what could be potentially a very long tenure at the head of North Korea. So I think he has every incentive to engage in a transactional approach. He just will need to believe that he can control it. I think he'll be looking to China for examples of how you do that, how you develop the economy while retaining the party in charge. I think the one sort of caveat I would put on that, I think we hear quite a lot about kind of China model work for North Korea. China is in real time now demonstrating the limits of that. So economic development as legitimacy does work while growth is in double digits. But when that slows down, it doesn't last forever, and you do still need a sort of sustaining underlying source of legitimacy. So I think there are aspects of the China model that North Korea could replicate. I think it will be very important that they keep, for instance, economic development to within zones rather than any sort of widespread exchange across the country. But I think that could become transformational in the sense that while we were in the fire and fury days, and you have the United States president effectively acting in the role that the Kim regime has told their people for generations exists. Like, this is the US president who's trying to destroy our country, we're protecting you from them. For the first time, they could just play the tape. So I think the more measured and reasonable United States engagement can be, the more that undermines that domestic narrative in North Korea.
I think your question in this exchange really is the nub, which is the relationship between the transactional and the transformational. Because the approach the Obama administration took to Iran was quintessentially transactional. But there was an implicit transformational bet underlying that in 15 years, Iran might be a different country. It was a bet, a defensible bet, but it was a bet nonetheless. And the question by decoupling the nuclear issue from the question of regime change, regime evolution, you're essentially playing a long game with North Korea. And if you look at a country which is essentially a family cult with a failed state, all the indicators, you sort of wonder, like, how can they keep this thing going, in this way? That something eventually is going to have to give. You look at different, Kennan's approach. I mean, we have the Kennan Institute here. His X article was called "The Sources of Soviet Conduct." It wasn't containment, a strategy for the Cold War. It was essentially a holding operation to allow the internal contradictions to play out over time. This is what a transactional approach would do: constrain the capabilities and allow this internal process to sort of play out. And there, if you had to bet, and there have been plenty of conferences on, wither the North Korean regime, you look at how regimes and countries of concern have changed. You had South Africa, where an elite kind of had an epiphany and changed internally, unexpectedly. And then you had Romania, which is kind of sudden regime collapse when the military and the security forces flipped on the regime. If I had to bet, North Korea is the Kim family is going to go the way of Ceausescu, but you can't put a date on it, and that could be a really pretty volatile process itself. But it would be pursuing the transactional and allowing this process to play out. And the more that North Korean societies is exposed to the outside world, there was that song in the late 70s, or the book, "We Envy Nothing in the World," or something like that. No one eating 2 meals a day and whose kid is 5 inches shorter than a South Korean kid is going to plausibly be singing a song, "We have nothing to envy in the world." They know what the outside world is, and that creates certain, the term's been used, poison carrots. The question, and linking your question to Katie to the question you asked me, is this sustainable? Can we play out a transactional approach that does decouple the nuclear issue from the regime change question when we define threat in terms of the character of the regime? And I think that's a very tough diplomatic strategy to implement. Ambassador Roy's in the audience, and was involved in diplomacy during the détente period where this was attempted. But it's controversial, and I don't know whether things can happen along the way. So, but I think that the the immediate transformational approach cannot be achieved short of really the things that we look like we were headed toward in 2017, the military track, which would be catastrophic.
Thank you, Rob. Sorry,
Sorry, can I add a couple of things about the introduce our arguments? One is there is a suspicion if Mr. Trump's end goal would be the withdrawal of American troops from the Korean Peninsula. And that's a suspicion leads to a kind of argument that President Trump may compromise somewhat too easily at the expense of kind of security interests of the region. And somewhat related argument in Japan is, dominant argument in Japan is regarding decoupling. Some of our security experts use this decoupling in a somewhat different way, context. That is, decoupling of ballistic missiles threat to the United States from short and medium-term missiles. And so when some of our experts hear the term decoupling, that's what they think about. And this is similar to the first issue, U.S. Possibility of compromising with North Korea at the expense of kind of regional and Japanese security interest. I just introduced as our somewhat dominant argument.
Great. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We have microphones on the side. Prashant. I think that's Prashant.
Hi, Prashant Parmaswaran with The Diplomat magazine and here at the Wilson Center. My question is for Rob, going off of this transactional versus transformational approach, to what extent, and I know some are already thinking about this, to what extent should we be worried about a scenario where the failure of transactionalism or transformation within the Trump administration's approach to North Korea could lead to an intensification of that quest for transformation? I mean, given the fact that you have folks like John Bolton in the administration, could there actually be more of an intensification of this approach where you have less of a concern for the dynamics of diplomacy if negotiations hit some sort of roadblock? And then I guess a secondary corollary part to that question is, and this is a tough question, obviously, but during the Bush administration, its approach towards rogue regimes.
The first one was a tough question, by the way. Okay.
The Bush administration's approach to some of these rogue regimes, the case of Libya ultimately ended up being one of the more consequential cases that other regimes sort of took a lesson from. Do you see any other cases, thinking ahead, where we might see a similar dynamic, where North Korea and Iran might be influenced by other foreign policy cases where the administration is taking a similar transformation approach? Thanks.
That's great. Let me go with the second question first. The Libya precedent, I mean, in 2003, December, we woke up and we were surprised by the announcement, Tripoli, London, Washington, that this deal had been done, that to remove, comprehensively, disarm Libya. And the narrative from the Bush administration then was that Gaddafi had been scared straight by the Iraq War demonstration effect. But there was a tacit but clear security assurance that if Gaddafi gave it up, the United States would fall off of the objective of regime change. And that offered a kind of a contrasting precedent to the Iraq War and what someone referred to as uncooperative threat reduction. Then 2011 happened, and the NATO takedown of the Gaddafi regime, which was done under a humanitarian rubric. Now, at the Wilson Center, we could have, and we have had seminars that have debated the distinction between a humanitarian and a counterproliferation war of regime change. But it's a distinction without a difference from Pyongyang, Tehran, et cetera. So the Libya option was sort of, as precedent, was taken off the table, and that's why yet another reason why zero weapons is not on the table as long as the Kim family kind of rules. Now, the other precedent that's out there is Pakistan. And North Korea keeps basically saying, we want to be Pakistan, like normalize our weapons program. And that, of course, has creates rancor in Seoul and Tokyo. They are living in the neighborhood with it. They have lived with the North Korean threat since 2006. we're in this position where we don't want to accept them as Pakistan, but we know that zero is not on the table. So it's a contradiction in our policy, one that creates an uneasy status quo to live with or not, which then goes to your question of whether your first question of whether transactional diplomacy kind of goes nowhere, whether then there will be increased pressure for a kind of a fire and fury alternative. And I think that's an alternative pathway if relations deteriorate. I think the President Trump has a personal investment in it, so perhaps that's a hedge against it really going too far south, the relationship. But they could come back to the kind of rhetoric of 2017 if this process, the diplomatic process, is derailed.
Great. Other questions? Yes, in the front there. You wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Ashley, I'm a researcher at National Security Action. I had a question about where we should be looking in the Trump administration for shifts in the strategy, perhaps toward this more transactional approach. Just last week, Bolton in the in the Washington Examiner had mentioned that sanctions relief could be considered if we saw a sign toward denuclearization rather than the previous really strict comments you saw in CVID from Pompeo and Bolton. What do you think is driving that approach? Do you think this is something with inter-Korean relations or politics for Trump? So what do you think we could see to indicate this shift? Thanks.
It's hard to say. I think was that directed to me? Okay. Okay. It's hard to say. It may be that how the North Koreans have been balking at kind of rudimentary steps that would, beyond the more ones that have been dismissed as kind of being sort of showcases that were like the tunnel and the one site that make for good photo op, but really don't really constrain the capabilities that much. It may be just a recognition that they're going to have to pivot to something like the transactional, and I think not to go kind of postmodernist, but everyone needs their narrative, and I think our if you look at different negotiations, everyone comes out with a narrative. If we do a transactional deal, an interim deal essentially, North Korea will just crow, we're Pakistan now, okay? Our narrative would be, no, this is the first step toward long-term denuclearization, and that would be kind of how it would play, and I think would be politically sustainable, here.
Any other comments? Okay. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, ex-World Bank, and also follower of unification of North and South Korea. So aside from the transformational or transactional, I'd like to know your views on what the future holds in terms of ending the war in Korean Peninsula, that is peace treaty between U.S., South Korea, and North Korea, one. What happens when North and South reunite or stops the war? Is reunification necessary? What does South Korea want at this juncture? We talked about Trump meeting Kim, but what about the Korean president, South Korean president meeting the North? And also for Mr. Soya, isn't there any role as far as information dissemination for the 200,000 North Korean nationals, quote, living in Japan who has potentially a close tie with the North Koreans regime? Thank you.
Okay, the end of war.
Yeah.
So I think a peace treaty is substantially more complicated. I think an end of war declaration, there's a lot of speculation that may be coming up imminently. I mean, I think how this is presented in North Korea is that the war was already won. So they celebrate, they've don't talk about a truce. They talk about Victory Day on July 27th. The regime top officials drive around in cars with license plates that start 7/27. That the war ended in victory for the North Koreans is a strong part of the national narrative there. But having the United States give them this declaration would be a real victory for Kim Jong-un as an achievement of his own. So the story there is that his grandfather won the war, his father safeguarded the peace, and now he would be the guy to once and for all end the hostile US imperialist threat. So it would be a domestic political victory for Kim Jong-un, but I don't think it would necessarily meaningfully change much else in terms of threat perception, partly because the threat is in some senses fictional. I mean, the idea that there is this hostile force waiting to invade at any moment, that is of the regime's own making. But so I think it would be a helpful thing for Kim Jong-un's personal legacy. I don't think it necessarily shifts a great deal strategically on the peninsula. And I think in terms of exchanges between the two Koreas, I mean, there are many much better qualified people to talk about this than me, but I would say I think from Kim Jong-un's side, again, the real concern would be with that coming exchange of information and exposing too many of his own citizens to too much information from the outside world. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't talk from a South Korean perception.
Yes. I think ending the state of war, or I think is possible if dealt with, correctly. And by correctly, I mean make a clear distinction between the presence of UN forces, and the American military. And the presence of American military on the peninsula is as a result of Korea-US defense treaty, and after the war ended. So signing some sort of agreement to end the war, and this would be between, in fact, U.S. on the one hand and China and North Korea. South Korea is not a party to this, legally speaking, but of course it has important kind of involvement with the U.S. So I think if we make a clear distinction between these two, I think putting an end to the war, I think should be possible, and which should not affect the American military presence on the Korean Peninsula for different reasons. And I don't know whether or not discussions are moving along this line. And I wouldn't be surprised if this comes as a result of one of the future summits, if not the next one, and eventually. And regarding information of North Korean nationals in Japan, I'm not sure what kind of information is being asked, but I really don't know. I'm not an expert on this. And but there used to be substantial, traveling by North Korean residents in Japan to North Korea, and they were one of the important financial providers for North Korea. But as a result of sanctions, I think I just hear this vaguely. I mean, many of those activities have been under suspension, and I think when the process gets started, transactional or whatever, I think there should be a time and a case and occasion where Japan would begin to play an important role. And from North Korean perspective, if I were Mr. Kim Jong-un, I would try to think how to use the Japan card, somewhere and sometime in the process. And but maybe not now. And he may not know when and how yet. But there may come a time when Japan is to be expected much in the process. And we already have Pyongyang Declaration signed by Koizumi and Kim Jong-il. And neither Pyongyang nor Tokyo has yet to deny the legitimacy of this agreement. And we already have a framework with which to talk about eventual diplomatic normalization. And again, it may not be the time now, but eventually, if the process keeps going on, there may come a time. And so all the more, again, we should begin to think about those scenarios and cases in a truly strategic way.
Well, thank you very much. We're actually out of time for the event, but thank you all for coming today, and please join me in thanking the panelists for their presentations.